Chosen to Serve falls into a very small category of books for me. I wish it was longer. Rarely do I wish that books are longer than they are, and I'm someone who loves books. All too often, I feel like a big problem with books is that they're too wordy. They're adding stories or points that are of little value to the whole. I think we need a lot more editors in this world with the boldness to cut out more information from the books that they are given. Occasionally, though, I read a book and I want more out of the author. And Chosen to Serve by Shawn Lazar is such a book. I love everything in Chosen to Serve. I love the way the book is structured, which to me is the most convincing part for the book's argument. I love how Shawn handles the text and all the famous passages relating to divine election. Shawn does a great job delivering what turns out to be a rather basic point. When God elects people in the Bible, he elects them to service for his glory, and not into the church to determine their salvation. Your salvation and mine is not determined by God's sovereign choice, by his election, because God doesn't elect people in the Bible to save them. He instead elects people for a function, for a service for his glory. And Shawn very ably makes this point throughout what turns out to be very simple expositions of the text by looking at what each passage says in the context that it is given. And in passage after passage, what we see is that God's election is for service. I loved his bold choice for the first 8 chapters of the book. And I say it's a bold choice because the first 8 chapters of the book are so basic, they're almost juvenile in comparison to other theological books on election. It just feels so basic when you're reading through each of these chapters, and they're always so obvious that, yeah, of course in this passage the election is to service. And you see it again in the Old Testament, you see it again in the Gospels, you see it again in Acts, that God is choosing people, setting them aside for a purpose, for an act of service for his glory. You see that in a very superficial reading of each verse. So it's like, Shawn, I don't need you to show me all these places where God chose people for service. I can see it right in the Bible. But it's so important when beginning a conversation on election that we approach and discuss the passages on election that are in the Bible that are so often overlooked before we even begin a debate on if God elects people to eternal life. Because we should start the discussion with, okay, God has established a pattern. God has established how he works with election throughout the Old Testament, in the Gospels, and what we see in all of these narrative passages throughout the Bible is that God is always electing people every single time he elects them to service, and he is not electing them to salvation. So while these verses are basic, I think neglecting them is a major weak point in other works on this subject. The best chapter to me in the entire book is the 10th chapter, when Shawn looks at what Jesus means in Matthew 22:14, when Jesus says, "Many are called, but few are chosen." Shawn's explanation is so great, it fits very well with the larger parable, and this verse so often is used to speak of salvation and the importance of being chosen and put into the kingdom by God's foreordained eternal plans, when the passage is actually speaking about rewards and the importance of our service in this life. And it goes very well with all the other election passages in Matthew that lead you up to this parable. I have 2 favorite quotes in this book. The first is on rewards. God sees your faithfulness. He sees your integrity and your small acts of kindness, and he will reward you for it. That's the kind of God he is. When we see election as it is presented in the Bible, what it highlights is how kind God is, how compassionate God is to those who serve him. Election does not present God as an arbitrary being, choosing some for salvation and leaving others to damnation. What it highlights is God's good pleasure to reward his people who live for him. Another point that Shawn makes on Judas is my second favorite quote. The fact that Judas was among those chosen emphasizes our earlier discussion that election can be conditional. You can fail in the mission God has chosen you for, as Judas certainly did, and he knew it. So you can fail in your calling and your election. Judas did it, and he's just one example among many. My one complaint, though, about the book, as I was saying starting it off, is I just wish it was longer. There were multiple chapters where I got to the end and I'm like, this chapter needs another page or two. I want it to be more. I wanted him to go a little bit deeper into some of the passages, because I think there is even more information in the Bible to bolster his arguments that election is for service and not for salvation. Just a quick example, in his chapter on Acts 13:48, Shawn shows us that the Gentile appointment to eternal life is not a proof text for election to salvation. His exegesis of the larger passage is great. His comparison of verses 46 and 48 is right on, but I was a little disappointed he didn't mention Acts 13:47, because the quotation that's used there from Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 49 is a wonderful support of the interpretation that he brings up in the chapter. Paul is saying here that he is a light to the nations. The church is to be a light to the ends of the earth, because salvation is not for an elect specific group of people. And that goes wonderfully with Acts 13:46 and 48. I just wish it would have been included in the book. And there were a few other chapters where I just wanted Shawn to go longer. I wanted him to go deeper. But I do got to say that what was there, I enjoyed it all. And I enjoyed it so much that it left me wanting more. I highly recommend this book for anyone who has been trapped in what I see as a narrow view of election that does not take in all of the information throughout the Bible on this topic. So pick up a copy of Chosen to Serve and see what God has chosen you to do. If you've enjoyed this review and would like to stay engaged in the wonderful world of Christian literature, I would love for you to subscribe to the Rev Reads YouTube channel.